Hello, and welcome to Understanding VFX, the series where we break down effects in modern games and learn how to create VFX like the ones you see in your favorite games. As a disclaimer, I'm not condoning anyone replicating the effects of others for use in their own products. Simply recreating the work of another and selling it as your own is plagiarism, just as it would be in any other medium. The goal here is to understand the effect so that we can learn how to use similar techniques to create our own effects. As a result, I will not be recreating the effects exactly. I will merely be covering the basics required to create the effect, not all the detail work. I also cannot possibly know the exact methods they used, so these are just my best guesses. Now that we've got all the fun stuff out of the way, let's take a look at what we'll be learning about in this episode. In this video, we're going to be talking about an effect from the Resident Evil 2 remake. This game is a gorgeous reimagining of a very classic game that is a pretty big part of my childhood. And they've done a really great job of bringing this not only graphically but mechanically into, the modern era of games. It is scary, fun to play, and beautiful. In terms of visual effects, most of the effects are not really flashy, showy effects. They're mainly kind of grounded effects that are meant to pull you into that tense atmosphere and ratchet up the fear factor. So, there are a lot of typical things you'd expect to see in games in here, like rain, fire, mud, smoke, and mist. Not a whole bunch of mystical particle effects, but there are some pretty cool effects in this game. Some that we might cover in some future videos, such as you may have noticed in the intro, there is an explosion from this game that is super cool and really impactful. That I would like to break apart one day. Also, there is an effect where when you shoot zombies, it slowly reveals their inside, so it's like you're stripping away the flesh. It's really gruesome. There's a lot of really good blood and gore effect work in here, so some of that stuff I may touch in the future. But the effect that I want to tackle in this video is actually something that most people who've played are probably kind of familiar with, probably seen it a few times. So as you can see in this video, I'm about to die right now. And when you die in this game, it sort of fades to black over this cool little dissolve, and then it pops up with this "You are dead" screen where there is like a wooden floor with just some blood that is slowly trickling down it. So you can see probably the most overstated part of this effect is these little blood drops that are slowly trickling down here. But there's also, if you look a little bit further up here, you can see the actual bloodstain itself is kind of creeping a little bit. So there are a couple different mechanics to that effect that you'll have to tackle in different ways to really get the combined effect here. Also, you notice there are some things that are static in here, just like some little blood speckles, as if it was like ejected onto this surface at a high velocity and it just kind of splattered. So that's the main effect. Is we're gonna want to have a blood stain that starts off and then slowly creeps outward, and then from that blood stain we'll have a couple blood drops that just kind of slowly trickle down the surface. So with that, let's jump into Unreal and start working on the effect. So I have a blank project here, and we're going to import a couple things. We're gonna make a new folder called Materials. And then within Materials, we'll have text. Oh, nope, not that. We'll create a new folder called Textures, and then we're going to bring a couple textures in here. I think just two. So if I open Substance Designer, I'll quickly go over what I've done with these materials and how you can sort of get some baseline masks going that you can then use for an effect like this. The very first part of the texture that I'm creating up top here is this blood dripping effect. So if I bring this up where you can see it, you can see I just have a little line that's rounded off on the end. And so the idea is that these are going to be the drops that are slowly going across the surface. So the way I'm making this is I'm getting this radial gradient, and then I am stretching it. And for some reason this is not showing up super well here, but sorry, I'm shrinking it here, and then I'm stretching it super long, and then I'm cropping it and then dragging it up so that it's only covering about half the screen. And then the shrunken one I'm actually making slightly bigger, so that when I add it back in, blend it back into this one that I just cropped, we get this little nice bulb droplet edge of the drop as it's running down. And then I'm taking that and I'm plugging it into a normal node to make a normal map for it. And I'm also plugging it into the R channel of an RGBA merge, which is just texture packing a bunch of masks into a single texture that I'm going to output. So the next thing that I am creating here, creating is maybe a little bit of a strong word, but I'm taking this grunge map. So you can see this grunge map already kind of looks like a fluid splatter. And I'm doing some transformation to it to kind of squeeze it up to the top half of the screen because we want it to occupy the top half, and then we're going to have the blood drops come down from it. And then I'm doing a swirl to it to kind of give it a slightly more interesting shape. And then I'm using a levels node to bring up the level so it's not quite as dark. We want some contrast here, but we don't want it to be super contrasty, otherwise the blood will spread very far very fast. We just want certain areas of contrast that will fill in and a little bit of contrast out towards the edges where it'll move. And in this texture, it would probably be best to bring this into Photoshop to kind of clean up all the stuff around the edges. I will show you the kind of issues that arise from having these little specks on the edges. I'm not doing that here. I'm just doing sort of a quick and dirty. Here's the texture. Here's how we're going to make the effect out of it. But if you really want a nice effect, you probably want to spend a lot more time, give a lot more tender love and care to your textures to make sure that it is it's going to be moving exactly the way you want it to move. So I'm packing this slightly brightened, less contrasty version into the RGBA merge in the green channel. And then I'm going down for one more texture here that will be part of the blood splatter itself. And that is little speckles, little splatter droplets that I showed you before. So basically I'm getting this, what is this called? It's just called dirt. It actually kind of, to me, looks more like little fluid drops than dirt, so it works perfectly for us. I'm taking that and I am, messing with the contrast here to get a lot fewer speckles because we don't want a ton of them, we just want some of them. And then I'm taking this Bloodstain and I am still shrinking it a little bit on the y-axis, but not as much as I did for the Bloodstain itself, just to kind of mask off these speckles so that they're only around the Bloodstain. And then I'm using that to blend. So now we have a small amount of little speckles here around the Bloodstain, and we are plugging that into the alpha of the RGBA merge. And then finally, the very last thing that we are doing here is we are getting this plasma noise generator. I'm distorting it to get kind of a little bit more interesting noise in here. And what I'm going to be using this for is to kind of distort the path of the blood droplets that are moving so that they kind of look like a fluid that is flowing across the surface. So, you can do a lot of different things. I'm doing this trapezoid transformation that allows me to squeeze or stretch the top or the bottom to kind of give it sort of different flow attributes the closer or farther it is away from the Bloodstain. You could also just make a texture to do this, manually if you really want to have fine control over how the blood is going to move. And then I'm feeding that into a blur here to kind of make it a little bit smoother. And then I'm feeding that into the RGBA merge. So then I am exporting all of these. And so these are going to be packed into a single targa, and then this normal is going to be an additional targa. So we're going to go back to Unreal, and I'm going to bring both of those in. So we have the normal here. Open the wrong window. I'm going to turn off MIP maps because this is kind of a cinematic effect that we're only going to see close up. So you just want it to look how you want it to look. We're not going to be moving the camera a lot relative to it. So we're going to save that one. And then we're going to open up the blood output, which opened in the wrong window. And I'm going to change the compression of this to masks. I have found personally that I kind of like the effect that gives on masks. So, you know, that's sort of personal preference, but that's one I like using. I'm also going to turn off MIP maps, and turning off masks also turns off sRGB. But if you did a different kind of compression with a mask, you'd still want to turn off sRGB because you're not going for the full color image. You're going for each individual channel by itself. Okay, so now that we have all of these changes, we're going to save that. We're going to close it. And then we are going to create a material out of this. So we're going to call this Bloodstain. We're going to open this material. We're going to make it a masked material. You could theoretically just blend this onto another texture that would be your surface, like in the thing, but we're actually just going to make this masked and then put it on the floor of the world. So we've got our texture sample here, and just to start off with, let's work on the blood stain itself, sort of creeping outward, that little slow encroachment. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to manipulate the image. That's wrong. We don't want a panner. We want a power node. So we're going to plug the green channel into this power node here, and we're going to get a scalar parameter. But we're not going to use this in the long run. We're just going to use this for now. If you wanted to do this manually through like sequencer or through blueprints, you could totally use a scalar parameter to drive this power node. However, I'm going to do this by time, so it just loops. But for now, we're going to look at the scalar parameter so that we can see how this is working. So we're going to plug that in. We'll just make the default, I guess, 1. It doesn't really matter. We're going to add, and I'll open all these up so you can see what's going on with these. We're going to add, what are we going to add? We're going to add 0.4. So essentially, you can see what I've done here is this isn't actually doing anything, but this will actually change what you can see of the texture that we're plugging in, and this is going to bump up the texture so that some of the values are over 1, and then we're going to take a floor of this, which essentially what this does is round everything down, so you can see now that it's actually removed some of the detail in there. So then now that we have the floor, we're going to clamp this, so we're just getting values between 0 and 1. Which, I mean, we should, but later on I'm actually going to add something in before this clamp. So I just want the clamp here so I don't have to wrangle some nodes later. Then we're going to multiply, and we're going to multiply by a color so that this is going to be a blood stain instead of just a white stain, like white paint or something. And we're going to go about 0.5-ish for the color. That's a good crimson, bloody kind of color. And we're going to save this and take a look in a material instance how this is working. So we're going to create a material instance. Whoop. There we go. And we're going to put this on a cube. And then now we're going to enable the scalar parameter and just tinker with it. So you notice the higher the power goes up, the more this shrinks. So actually what we want to do is increase the power so that it looks like blood is sort of spreading outwards. So you can kind of see how that works. It gives a nice effect. It just kind of creeps outward and it fills in the circles. And then once you get to 0, then it just fills the whole thing. So you never want to get to 0. But so that's how that works. So what we want to do is we want to build up sort of an input into this that is going to do this automatically for us. So we're going to grab a time node, and we're going to divide this time node by 10. And we can actually, we just call this blood creep time and make this a scalar parameter. That way you could actually change this in an instance if you wanted to. So basically what this is doing is it's saying it's going to take 10 seconds to get to 1 second, essentially. So between 0 and 1, it's going to take 10 seconds, which means that this is going to loop every 10 seconds. And the way we're going to make it loop instead of just go on instantly is by doing frac. So essentially what this is doing is it's only taking values between 0 and 1. So once it goes between 1 and 2, it's just resetting at 0 again and counting up to 1 the closer you get to 2. So it's essentially like just the decimal point that you're returning, not the actual like whole number second. And then since we want this to go from larger number down to a smaller number to creep outward, we're going to get a 1 minus node. Now, if we plug this in, we take a look at what it's doing, we should get that blood creep effect. So you can see, pretty simple to get this effect. It's pretty straightforward. Oh, I shouldn't have deleted that. That made it recompile. But you can see now, actually pretty nice, pretty smooth blood creep effect. Most of the work that you have to do with this is going to be within the texture itself. So like I said before, there are some issues with this texture I use. You can kind of see that blood just kind of appears out of nowhere on the edges of the texture. So you really want to make sure, if you're doing this for a game or anything, that you have a nicely manicured texture that doesn't have all these rough edges around it. And also, the more work that you put into how the gradient of the texture is, the better your blood flow is going to be, and the more of an artistically driven effect you can have. So this is just a procedural texture, but it looks pretty good for how much work that I've put into it up until this point. It's pretty quick to get to this point. However, it's not the only thing we want here. So like I mentioned before when we were looking at the Resident Evil effect, which I can bring up here, you can see that there are these little specks here. And these specks don't actually grow in size. They just are kind of static. So if you were to add these in while all this power work is going on, and power, the add and the floor, they would actually change in size, and it would look kind of weird because they're just little specks and they don't really have a lot of blood in them. The pool itself is a lot more volume, so it can theoretically spread, whereas the little specks shouldn't be doing that. And also you'll get kind of a similar effect to these little bits off the edge that are just appearing. And we don't want that. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to take the alpha here, which if you remember from our image is where we put our little specks at. And we are going to multiply this by a number to kind of bring them out a little bit, to make them a little bit more apparent. The higher the number that you multiply by here, the more you'll be able to see. So if I get this to pop up, you can see a decent number there. And if I go up to 100, you'll be able to see a lot of them and they'll be very apparent. I think 10 is kind of a good number. The more you bring out, the busier it gets and the less good it looks, in my opinion. So we're just going to multiply that. And we are going to add it in before the clamp. And that's why we have the clamp here, because we're adding these in and the number is going to be over 1. And we're going to use this as a mask later for some other things. So we don't want the value to be over 1. But now you can see we have some specks in here. The specks are not growing. Instead, the bloodstain itself is growing. And it kind of joins up a little bit with the specks, which is kind of nice. So it gives some sort of fake, nice fluid behavior. So the next thing we want to do here, now that we have this working out pretty nice, is we want some normals from this. Because right now this is just a flat effect, right? And there are a couple other things that we can do. Also, before we grab the normals, I can just real quick make some other, or change some of these other attributes. So we want roughness, but if you plug this directly into roughness, you're actually going to get the opposite of what you want, where all the black values are not going to be rough and the blood is going to be rough. So we want a 1 minus node in here. And we're going to plug that in. So now we've got shiny blood, but it still looks pretty flat. So we're going to get our normals now. So we did not make normals for this in Substance Designer, and it's kind of difficult to make normals for this because you have something that is moving over time. You can't really apply the same effects directly to normals and get that to work out the same way. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to do normal from function, which is a function in Unreal that allows you to take, instead of just a texture object, which normal from height map would do, you can just grab a channel off of here and then use that to make some things. So the way this node actually works, if we take a look at it, it takes in coordinates, it takes in an offset, and it takes in an intensity for the normal. And then from those coordinates and from that offset, it spits out 3 sets of UVs that you then have to plug into a texture or what have you to determine what the offset of the normals will be. And then you plug those back in here as images or colors. And that is what it constructs the normal out of that you can then make over here. So we need a couple things, a couple scalar parameters here. We need the normal offset. And we want this to be a pretty small value. You don't want a lot of offset. And with this node, higher offset values tend to look not so great. So we're just going to plug normal offset right there in the height map UV offset. And then we're going to get normal intensity scalar parameter. Whoa. I'm having a brain fart. Intensity. I think I spelled that right. I hope I spelled that right. If not, whatever. And this is going to be 1. So now we've got our 2 parameters in here. It's going to automatically just take the standard texture coordinates since we're not actually changing them with this. And so now what we'll have is we will have 3 sets of UVs to pull off of. So UV1 is just the standard where you want the image to be, and UV2 and UV3 are going to be offsets. So unfortunately, what we need to do here is copy all of this, and this is, you know, not, I guess, the cheapest thing in the world. It's not super expensive, but it is essentially doing all of this math 3 times, but it works out in the long run for us. So the first thing, we plugged in UV1, so we want to plug that into function UV1 here. We're going to plug in UV2. So we want to plug that into function UV2 here. And then we want to make one more copy. And then we're going to plug that in the function UV3. And we're going to plug that into the UVs. So now, if we plug that into normals, we get some pretty, whoa, that is not the way that should look. So I have done something horribly wrong here. What's going on? Oh, I know what's wrong. I didn't plug the time stuff into the powers for the offsets. So it was only expanding one thing. So now you can see we've got normals for the fluid that are automatically generated based on where the mask is at that point in time. So now we've got a slightly more 3D looking effect, all procedurally done. So that should work pretty well. We're probably going to want to clean this up a little bit, use some reroute nodes here because this will get very busy very quickly. So we'll just drag these out. Okay, now we've got that a little bit more organized, and we can move on with the effect. So we've got our normals for the bloodstain, and it's also generating normals for the little specks too. So you can see that there. One thing you'll notice is that we have just this black background. So we're actually going to want to have a opacity mask for this. And for the time being, we can just plug this in, although we're going to add some stuff in a second. That we'll need to change that. But for now, you can see we've got this opacity mask. We've got our bloodstain that's just kind of growing out here. We can drag a cube into the world. Just put our instance on that. I got to apply that first. All right, so now you can see, pull that up just a bit. So now you can see we've got our bloodstain. Oh, our bloodstain that is just kind of growing out there. It's got some normals to it, so it looks kind of like an almost thick pool of blood. You notice the normals are a little sharp, and that's because we're doing it procedurally with just these offsets. This would not be a great way to get something that has a little bit more rounded effect to it, and so that is a slight visual quality thing that you have to deal with here, but I think it's good enough for our purposes. So now we're going to move on to adding our blood drops in. So what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate our texture here, and we're going to get a panner, and we're going to plug that in the UVs, and we want it to pan down, so -1 on the Y. We'll keep the coordinates, I think, for now. I think, you know, same coordinates should be fine. We'll offset through other means, and we're just going to grab time. We're going to plug that into the time here, because we're going to manipulate that in a minute. But for now, let's just kind of take a look at what this will look like when we add it in. So we're going to grab the normals as well, so it won't look totally out of place. So we'll plug that into the UVs. And we're going to want to take just the red channel from this, and we're going to, we'll just add it with, we'll just add it to this, which is everything else we had. And we'll see what that looks like. Oh, I didn't, I also didn't multiply it. So you want to have the same thing going into the multiply so that it looks all right, and into the roughness. So this is going to become your new standard plugin for everything. And so you can notice, first of all, we've just got this drip that comes down. It shows up on top of everything else, and it's not super well blended in. It's not super dynamic. It doesn't really look all that good. So we're going to do a few things here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to distort this. So we want to take this texture sample again, and we want to get the blue channel, which is our plasma distortion texture. And we're going to multiply this by a scalar. And the scalar will be our distortion intensity. We're going to plug that in. And I'm just going to go 0.05 on that. And what we're going to do is we're going to add this after the pan. And we're actually just going to get a break float two components, because we're going to have to start juggling these things if we're not careful. So I just want to add a node in that we're going to be using later. And then after this, we'll have appends for every single texture, because we're going to want to do some offsets. So just future-proofing myself here. But so these two will have the same exact textures. So now you can see, now that we've added in the distortion to our UVs, we're getting this neat little wiggly line that comes down. So it kind of behaves a little bit more like a fluid. Although you notice it's just kind of rocketing across the texture super fast. So we're going to want to divide this time by a pretty decent number to make this much slower. And you could parameterize this. I'm not going to, but we'll say 50. Say 50 is a good number. So if that will compile, now you can see it's much slower and it kind of looks like fluid just trickling down. So we're getting there. One thing you'll notice is that this is out of sync with our Bloodstain, so they don't reset at the same time. And the reason is because we're doing these on different time scales. So the way that we can deal with this is using a node called fmod. And essentially this is just like a modulus. It's getting the remainder of a division. So basically you're feeding in 10 and you're saying, all right, what's left over from that? And that's what's going to spit out. So between 0 and 10, it's just going to spit out whatever number. And then past that, it's going to, start doing that again. So between, 10 and 20, it's going to spit out whatever number is the remainder. So essentially this is bookending this between 0 and 10 seconds, just like our Bloodstain is. If you watch it, it's dripping down, Bloodstain's creeping, and then when the Bloodstain resets, so too does the drip. So we're getting places. It's not perfect yet. We're going to do a couple things here. First of all, we want a few of these drips. But probably more importantly, before we even get to that, we want to mask this, because this is not looking so hot where we just have, the drip overlaying with the Bloodstain. So we're gonna mask this procedurally. We're gonna get a linear gradient, and I should probably actually comment some of these things out so it won't be so confusing. So this will be the Bloodstain encroachment and normals. And we'll just kind of pull this up, and this will be blood drops. So now we've got this linear gradient here. We're going to feed this into a power node, and we're going to raise it to the power 3 because I've tinkered with these numbers a lot, and this is what gives me the line where I want it to be. We're going to add, so we're adding 0.9. And essentially what this is doing is it's kicking a lot of these values that, as soon as this loads up, you'll see these values where it was a gradient that's getting pretty close to 0 and kicking them up over 1. And then we're going to use a floor node again to drop everything that is over 1 to 1 and everything that's under 1 to 0. So now if that'll show up, yeah, you can see we have a line that goes across the bottom half. We don't want the bottom half. We want it to mask the top half because that's where our Bloodstain is. So we got our 1 minus. And then we're going to put an add node in because we also want the Bloodstain to mask the drops wherever the Bloodstain is. And in some places, the Bloodstain will encroach past the line. You don't want to have the line below the Bloodstain because then you'll get some hard edges that don't look nice. So now you can see we've got the line across the top. And then we've got Bloodstain little bits coming out of the bottom as it creeps out. And then we are going to use a lerp. We're going to use that as the alpha. And then plug in to the 1, which is where that above the line and where the stain is. It will spit the stain in, and then it will put in the blood drops where the black is. So now, if we plug that into everything we had that plugged into before, we should see something starting to happen that we like. And I'll also start using this mask for the normals because we want the normals to be represented as well. So we get an add node, and I'm going to drop the normals into that add node, and then drop that into the lerp. So now, if all is well, when we apply this, we should see that we are masking off the blood drops so that they only show up below the Bloodstain. We did not all is well. So what have I done wrong? Okay, so I made a couple small mistakes here. First of all, I'm taking the color as opposed to just the red channel for the drops, which is a big no-no. And the other thing I'm doing is I have not clamped this mask. So it's taken some values that are not totally kosher. So we're gonna make sure that we clamp this first before plugging it into the lerps. Because if you get negative numbers, then the lerp will kind of lose its mind. So now you can see it is correctly blending things and everything looks good. So now we've got a mask specifically for the blood drops. Let's kind of clean this up ever so slightly. So we want to label this mask as well. So this will be Bloodstain mask, I guess we'll call it. And now what we want to do is we want to have more than one drop, and also we kind of want to position them a little bit more strategically than we have done so far. So we're going to move this out here. We're going to add to the X coordinate of the UVs for this. And we're going to add, what do we want? Let's say 0.25, and we're going to plug that into the append. And that's why we have the append here, is because we're using that to transform the UVs so that we move the blood drop. So now the blood drop's not coming out of the center, it's coming out of a specific point over here. And we're going to do this a couple times. So we're going to do 3 drops here. Where did that go? Huh, that didn't copy for whatever reason. So we're gonna grab this. We're gonna plug that into the UVs. But this time we're going to transform it on both axes by a different value, because we want it not only to be shifted along the X, but we don't want it to drop out at the same time, because then it'll look a little bit too uniform if all the drops are just coming out at the same time. So we're going to actually add a negative number here. Could have just subtracted, but this should be fine. So 0.025, and then we'll go negative 0.05. And you want to make sure that you don't transform the Y too much, because if you transform the Y too much, you'll start seeing some more artifacts. Like, you know, you might push the drop out and then you'll see the end of the tail. Or conversely, if you add to it rather than subtracting from it, then you'll see it at the bottom, which you do not want. So we need to add these in to the other drops that we already have. So we'll add in the normal as well. So now you can see we have a second one. It is offset. It's also coming down a little bit sooner than the other one. So now that gives a little bit more variability. But we want one more. So we're actually going to drag this up a little bit so we have a little more space. We're just going to duplicate these. And we don't need to transform the Y again, because we're already doing it for the middle ones. That's sort of providing the variation for us. We do want to transform the X though, and we're going to push that even further to the right. So we want negative 0.18 should be good for that. And now we're going to add that in. So we need another add. That didn't plug in. Another add. We're going to add in normals. So now we can plug this new add into here and into the normal lerp. That way we're lerping everything together. So you can see now we've got 3 different drops, and you can see since we're offsetting these against a noise texture, they each take their own path, which gives it even more sort of dynamism and interesting detail to it. So we've got that now. So, you know, the effect's looking pretty good. If we look really close, I need to apply that. I haven't applied that in a while. But if we look really close, once this is compiled, you can see that there's some small issues, such as the specs kind of just appear on top of it, and this is not going in real time for some reason. Where's that button? Here it is. Okay, gotta check that so it'll be in real time. So you can see as the blood trickle sort of moves over these specs, it just sort of goes under them, which doesn't make any sense. It would sort of supersede them, make them part of the blood trickle. So we need to take what we're doing here with these drops and subtract that from the specs so that the specs don't show up over them. So the way that we're going to do that, and since these blood drops are made with a gradient, so they're not exactly values of 1 yet, what we're going to do is we're going to take this and we're going to add to it so that we get over a value of 1. Add 0.8, it's probably a good number, and then we're going to take a floor of this once again. And then we're going to 1 minus that, so we get a negative value. So if we take a look at what that has done, you'll see that we have a mask over the drops. So now you can see we have the drops coming down, and it's essentially masking that out. So we need to add that into our specs. So we're going to move this way back here so we can see where all that is. So this is where our specs are. So we're going to multiply all of these by that value. So we plug this into every single one of them. And then we plug in the specs into that and plug that into the rest of it. Now we should have this effect masked off so that it does not put those blood specks on top of the trickles. Now if I get really close, you can see that they're just not in the way, and when they are, they just kind of get eaten up, swallowed, so to speak. If I can find, yeah, in some cases it totally masks them out ahead of time. In some cases, there are still specks there, as you'll see here, and it just kind of sucks that bit up, which looks good. It kind of looks like fluid behavior, even though it's just a fake effect that we're adding in there. So I think that is basically all we're going to do with this. So I mean, it's a pretty straightforward effect. As I said before, it's not going to be 100% all the detail work, 100% quality effect. This is just showing how you can kind of create these two different effects and put them together, where you have, you know, a bloodstain that gets bigger, and you have these little drops that sort of trickle down and move in a dynamic, fluid-like way. If you want an effect like this for a game, you can, you know, take these effects but do a lot more in the texture department to really make something that looks more convincing and looks really good in a game. And I would be thrilled to see what you folks can think up with a sort of similar effect using these sort of basic building blocks. I hope you learned something, and thank you for watching the video. Hope you have a great day.